When I stepped into the courtroom drenched from the storm, carrying a mud-stained wooden box against my chest, my wife leaned toward her lawyer and smiled like the verdict was already hers. My son stared at the floor. Her attorney rose and said, "Your Honor, this is a simple guardianship case. He can't manage his own life anymore." I said nothing. I placed the dripping box before the judge. The moment he opened it, his face drained of color. Then he whispered, "Where did you get this? I am genuinely grateful you chose to spend your time here with me today." Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world are you watching from your city, your country. I want to know who is out there. A small note: this story weaves fictional elements into its telling for reflection and for meaning. Names and places are purely coincidental, but every lesson inside it is worth carrying with you. The storm had been building since before dawn, the kind that doesn't knock before it arrives, just shoulders its way in and decides to stay. By the time my taxi pulled up to the Harris County Courthouse, the rain was coming down in sheets so thick I could barely see the stone steps leading up to the entrance. I paid the driver, tucked the wooden box under my arm, and stepped out into it. I didn't run, there was no point. A man my age in a coat like mine, running through a storm with a mud-caked box that would have been a different kind of statement than the one I intended to make. So I walked, one step at a time. The rain soaked through the shoulders of my old overcoat within seconds, dragging the wool down heavy against my arms. My shoes filled with water at the curb. By the time I reached the top of the courthouse steps, I was thoroughly, completely drenched. I didn't mind. The box I kept dry. I pressed it against my chest under the flap of the coat. It was the only thing that mattered. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of floor wax and old paper, and the particular kind of quiet that only exists in places where people come to be judged. A security officer at the door checked my name against his list. He looked at me, at the wet coat, the mud on my hands, the box, and his expression shifted into something that looked a great deal like pity. I gave him a slow, slightly confused smile. The kind he expected. "Right through there, sir," he said, and pointed toward courtroom 4. I heard Eleanor before I saw her, her laugh bright, easy. The laugh of a woman who has already decided how the morning will end, floated through the gap in the courtroom door like smoke. I pushed the door open with my shoulder because both hands were occupied, and I stepped inside. She was already seated at the petitioner's table, dressed in a charcoal blazer that probably cost more than my first car. Her hair was perfect, every strand in its place. She looked like a woman waiting for a charity luncheon, not a woman who had been putting sedatives in her husband's evening tea for the better part of a year. Victor Sloan. Her attorney sat beside her with a leather portfolio open in front of him and a yellow legal pad aligned to the exact edge of the table. He was 45, maybe 46, with the kind of jawline that probably won him a lot of arguments before he ever opened his mouth. He was speaking quietly into Eleanor's ear when I walked in, and the way she tilted her head toward him, shoulders relaxed, lips curved, was not the posture of a woman consulting her lawyer. I filed that away. My son Julian sat one row back in the gallery. He was wearing a charcoal cravat that I recognized I had given it to him 3 Christmases ago, back when giving him things still felt like an expression of love, rather than an investment in a man who was deciding what I was worth. He looked up when I walked in, and his eyes moved over me, the way a man looks at an object he's already decided he no longer needs. Then he straightened his cravat and looked away. 3 seconds, that was all I was worth to my son that morning. 3 seconds and an adjusted cravat. My mother-in-law, Eleanor's mother, Judith, sat 2 seats down from Julian, with her arms folded and her lips pressed into a line that communicated everything without saying a word. She had never particularly cared for me. The feeling was mutual, and we had maintained a cordial distance for 15 years on that basis. I walked to the respondents' table. Margaret Hale was already seated there, a slim woman in her late 50s with silver hair cut close to her jaw and reading glasses perched at the end of her nose. She had been my attorney for 8 months. No one in that courtroom knew her name yet. That was intentional. "You're soaked," she said quietly. "I'm aware," I said. "The box?" "Intact." She gave a small nod and returned to her notes. I set the box down on the table gently, carefully, right in the center. The mud from the cemetery was still caked into the grain of the wood and drying in patches on the leather bindings. Water dripped from the corner of the lid onto the polished tabletop and spread in a slow, dark circle. Victor glanced over from the petitioner's table. His eyes moved to the box, then to me, then back to Eleanor. He said something I couldn't hear. Eleanor looked at the box for a moment. I saw her eyes stop on it just briefly. the way a person's eyes stop on something that doesn't fit the picture they've constructed. Then she smiled at whatever Victor had said, and the smile was easy and unhurried, the smile of a woman who had no reason to worry about a mud-caked box brought in by a confused old man. She had no idea what was inside it. That was the whole point. The clerk called the case. We rose. Judge Robert Harrison entered from the side door, black robe swinging slightly as he took his seat. He was in his early 60s with close-cropped gray hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. I had looked him up. He had clerked for a federal judge in the late 90s, built his career on contract disputes and estate litigation, and was known, according to 3 different attorneys, Margaret had consulted for not tolerating theater. Good, I had thought when she told me that. I hadn't come to perform. He surveyed the room, the way experienced judges always do, quickly, efficiently reading the geometry of the space before anyone speaks a word. His gaze moved from the petitioner's table to the respondent's table and then stopped, just for a moment, just a beat longer than routine. His eyes settled on my face, and something moved across his expression that I couldn't quite name. Not recognition exactly. More like the beginning of a question he hadn't expected to be asking this morning. He glanced down at the case caption on the papers in front of him, then back at me. His jaw tightened slightly. Victor rose without waiting to be addressed. Your Honor, if I may, this is a straightforward guardianship matter. My client is petitioning for conservatorship over the respondent, her husband of 15 years, who has exhibited a significant and documented decline in cognitive function. We have a full medical evaluation on record, and we believe this matter can be resolved today. He said it the way people read grocery lists, items to be collected, nothing more. Eleanor folded her hands on the table and nodded with the practiced gravity of a concerned wife. Julian watched from the gallery, arms crossed, expression neutral. I picked up the wooden box with both hands. My hands were trembling. They always trembled now. A performance I had maintained so consistently over the past several months that it required almost no effort anymore. I pushed back my chair, rose slowly, and walked toward the bench. The bailiff moved. Sir, he's the respondent, Margaret said, her voice clear and calm. He has the right to approach the bench to present material to the court. The bailiff looked at the judge. The judge held up one hand, and the bailiff stepped back. I set the box on the edge of the bench directly in front of Judge Harrison. The mud from the lid left a faint smear on the polished wood. I didn't apologize for it. I stepped back, folded my trembling hands in front of me, and waited. The judge looked down at the box. His hand moved to the latch fingers, settling on the old brass clasp, weathered and dark with age. And he lifted the lid. The judge's hands didn't move after he lifted the lid. I watched him from where I stood, an old man in a wet coat 3 feet from the bench, hands folded, waiting. I had imagined this moment many times over the past 8 months. I had not imagined what his face would do. He looked at the contents of the box for what felt like a very long time. In reality, it was probably 5 seconds. But 5 seconds of silence in a courtroom, real silence, the kind where nobody shifts in their seat or clicks a pen, has a weight that minutes in ordinary rooms don't carry. Then he reached in. His fingers found the badge first. I knew they would. I had placed it on top, deliberately nestled against the folded edge of the first sealed envelope. It was a commission badge, old gold, the kind they don't mint anymore, the emblem of the Federal Financial Integrity Task Force, a division of the Department of Justice that had been quietly dissolved in 1999 after completing the single largest coordinated anti-fraud restructuring in American federal history. The Meridian Reform, the press had called it. 27 financial institutions, 41 senior executives, 114 indictments over 3 years. I had run the investigation. Not publicly, not with my name in the newspapers. That was never how I had worked. The man whose name appeared on the press releases had been the director, a good man named Calloway, who understood that the most effective investigators were the ones nobody remembered. I had been nobody on paper for 30 years. That was how I preferred it. Judge Harrison turned the badge over in his fingers. His knuckles had gone pale. He looked up at me, and I watched the question form in his eyes before it reached his mouth. Watched him search my face the way a law student searches a casebook for a precedent he can't believe he's actually found. I need a moment, he said. His voice was careful, controlled, but something underneath it had shifted. He looked back down at the badge, then back at me. Sir, he said, were you part of the Meridian Reform? The courtroom did not go quiet. It had already been quiet. What happened was something different. The quality of the silence changed the way the air changes before lightning. I heard Eleanor inhale. I heard Victor's pen stop moving against his legal pad. I looked at Judge Harrison and nodded. Once, slowly. His jaw set. He placed the badge on the bench beside him, as carefully as if it were made of something that could break. "I see," he said in a tone that meant something considerably more than those two words. Victor was on his feet before the judge finished speaking. "Your Honor, I'm not sure what is being presented here, but if this is intended as some kind of character reference, the rules of evidence—" "Sit down, Mr. Sloan," Judge Harrison said, without looking at him. Victor sat down. Eleanor turned her head slightly toward Julian in the gallery. The movement was small, barely a degree, but I had spent 15 years watching this woman, and I knew what it meant. It meant she was recalculating. She was not yet afraid, but she was no longer entirely comfortable, and that was a start. "Ms. Hale," the judge said, addressing Margaret for the first time, "I'll hear a brief summary of the respondent's position before we proceed." Margaret stood. She did not look at Eleanor. She did not look at Victor. She looked at the judge with the measured steadiness of a woman who had spent 30 years in courtrooms and understood that the most persuasive thing you can do is speak as though the facts require no persuasion. "Your Honor," she said, "the respondent does not dispute that his health has changed over the past year. What we dispute is the cause and the characterization. The petitioner has presented a medical evaluation and filed this petition on the basis that my client suffers from progressive cognitive decline, dementia specifically. We will show that the symptoms attributed to dementia were chemically induced deliberately over a period of at least 7 months. We will show that the physician who conducted the capacity evaluation was not legally licensed to do so in the state of Texas, and we will show that the petitioner had signed a residential care contract for my client 3 weeks before this court was ever asked to make a determination about his capacity." The room did not erupt. It was not that kind of moment. It was quieter than that, the particular quiet that follows a statement so direct that the air needs a moment to accommodate it. Victor stood again. "Your Honor, these are extraordinary allegations with no—" "They come with documentation," Margaret said, without raising her voice or turning her head. "Everything I've just described is in that box." Julian moved in the gallery, a small involuntary shift, like a man whose chair has been pulled from under him an inch. I did not look at him. I was not ready for that yet. I fixed my gaze on the middle distance and kept my hands still. Judge Harrison looked at the box, then at me, then at the badge still resting beside him on the bench. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, "please take your seat. Ms. Hale, you may proceed when ready. Mr. Sloan, you will have your opportunity, and I will expect you to use it professionally." He paused. "All of you." I made my way back to the respondent's table and lowered myself into the chair. My coat was still damp, still heavy. Margaret sat beside me, placed her legal pad in front of her, and wrote one line at the top. She turned it slightly so I could see. It read, "Hold. Let the room settle." I nodded. I had been holding for 8 months. A few more minutes was nothing. But as I sat there listening to the shuffle of papers at the petitioner's table, listening to Victor whisper something clipped and urgent into Eleanor's ear, I found myself thinking about a night 8 months ago. A different kind of quiet. The kitchen of our house on Briar Grove Drive at 10:30, the rest of the world asleep, a cup of Earl Grey steaming on the counter in front of me. I had lifted it to my lips, and then I had stopped. Something in the smell. Not wrong exactly, not obvious enough to call wrong, just different from the evening before. A faint medicinal undertone beneath the bergamot so slight that a man who wasn't already suspicious wouldn't have noticed it at all. I was already suspicious. I set the cup down. I looked at it for a long time. Then I walked to the sink, poured it out, and went to bed, stone cold sober, for the first time in what I slowly realized had been many weeks. That was the night the investigation began again. Not with anger, not with confrontation. The same way it had always begun, with a question, a notebook, and the understanding that if I was going to prove something, I was going to prove it properly. The sound of Eleanor's voice pulled me back to the present. She was leaning toward Victor, something sharp and quiet in her posture, and I caught just the edge of it. "What is he doing? What is she—" Victor's hand moved to her forearm, a steadying gesture. The gesture of a man who was used to touching this particular woman, not just advising her. I looked away. I already had that in the box, too. Margaret uncapped her pen and drew a quiet line beneath the words she'd written. Then she looked up at Judge Harrison and said, "Your Honor, the respondent is ready to proceed." A man who spent 30 years building federal cases learns one thing above everything else. Suspicion without evidence is just noise, and noise gets you nowhere except out of the room. So I did not act on the first night. I poured the tea down, the sink went to bed, and stared at the ceiling for 2 hours, with the calm, methodical part of my brain already making a list. The next evening, Eleanor brought my tea at the same time she always did, 9:30, Earl Grey, 1 sugar set on the side table next to my reading chair without a word. She was wearing the blue cashmere robe she favored in the evenings, and her expression was the one she had perfected over 15 years of marriage, attentive without being intrusive, warm without being excessive. The expression of a good wife. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" she asked, and her voice had just the right amount of gentle concern threaded through it, the kind that sounds like love until you start listening for what it's concealing. "Tired," I said. I let my hand tremble slightly as I reached for the cup. "My head's been foggy again." She made a soft sound, sympathetic, maternal. "You need your rest," she said. "Drink your tea." She left. I sat with the cup in my lap and waited until I heard her bedroom door close at the end of the hall. Then I got up, carried the cup to the window, and poured it very carefully into the soil of the potted fig tree Eleanor had placed there last spring. The fig tree that I now noticed was not looking especially healthy. Its leaves were yellowing at the edges in a way that had nothing to do with sunlight. I set the empty cup back on the table, returned to my chair, and picked up my book. The next morning, my head was clear, sharper than it had been in weeks. I could feel the difference the way you feel the difference between a fogged windshield and a clean one. Not dramatic, just suddenly, undeniably there. I read the newspaper from front to back. I did the crossword in ink. I finished in under 20 minutes. I had not done that in months. I ran the test 3 more nights in a row. Same result every time. Tea in the fig tree morning clarity, tea in my body, fog sluggishness, the sensation of moving through wet concrete that I had been attributing with increasing despair to my age. On the 5th morning, I sat in my study before Eleanor was awake, and I opened a notebook, one of the small leather ones I had kept in the bottom drawer since my federal days. The kind with the ribbon bookmark and the pages that don't yellow. I wrote the date at the top. Then I wrote everything I had observed in the precise, unsentimental language of a man writing a case report. Day 1 through 5, symptoms consistent with low-dose sedative exposure. Symptom-free on night's tea was not consumed. Consistent pattern. Conclusion, the tea is the vector. I closed the notebook. My chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with my heart. That afternoon, while Eleanor was at her garden club meeting, and Julian was wherever Julian went when he wanted me to believe he was working, I took the enamel mug I kept in my desk drawer, the old one from my federal days, that I had never thrown away for reasons I couldn't entirely explain, and I went to the kitchen. I poured a measure of the remaining tea from the pot Eleanor had prepared the night before into the mug and sealed it with a square of plastic wrap and a rubber band. I labeled it with the date in permanent marker and tucked it into the inside pocket of my winter coat, which was hanging in the hall closet behind 2 rarely worn jackets. Then I sat back down at my desk and waited. Samuel came in around 4, the way he always did, to ask whether I wanted anything before he started on dinner. Samuel Brooks had worked for me for 31 years. He had been my driver, my housekeeper, my occasional confidant, and the only person in a 3-mile radius whose judgment I trusted without reservation. He was 68 years old, built like a man 20 years younger, and possessed of the particular gift of knowing when to speak and when to do the more difficult thing, which was to stay quiet and pay attention. He looked at me when he came through the study door, and he stopped walking. "You look different," he said. "I feel different," I said. "Good different or bad different?" "Dosis bushiri bopikor." "Thinking different," I said. "Sit down, Samuel." He sat. I told him about the tea. Not everything, not yet. Just enough. Just the smell, the test, the notebook, the mug in the coat pocket. I watched his face as I spoke. His jaw tightened by degrees the way a man's jaw tightens when he is hearing something that confirms a suspicion he has been refusing to form. "How long?" he asked, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "At best I can estimate 4 to 5 months, I said. "Maybe longer." Samuel pressed both hands flat against his knees. His knuckles went white at the pressure. "Mr. Pendleton." "I know," I said. "Don't say it yet. I need you to do something for me first." He looked up, eyes sharp and steady, despite the color that had left his face. "Anything. From tonight forward, you switch my tea before you go to bed," I said. "Eleanor sets the pot. You empty it after she's asleep and refill it with the Earl Grey from the tin I'm going to put in the back of the pantry behind the canned goods she never touches. Every night. Same pot, same cup. She can't know anything has changed." Samuel nodded, slow and deliberate. "And the old stuff?" "Hey, save it," I said. "A sample from each night. Label it date, seal it the same way I showed you. Put them in the garden shed in the metal box behind the fertilizer. And you're going to keep pretending, he said. Not a question. I'm going to keep performing, I said, because that was the more accurate word. The fog, the trembling, the confusion, all of it. They need to believe it's working. Samuel looked at me for a long moment. His eyes were wet at the corners, not crying, not yet, but close. The kind of close that a man of his generation and his composure works very hard not to cross. All right, he said finally. His voice had steadied itself. All right, I'll do it. Good. I opened my desk drawer and took out a piece of paper with a name and a phone number written on it. There's one more thing. I need you to reach someone for me, not from the house phone, not from your cell. He took the paper and looked at the name. His eyebrows rose a fraction. There's a payphone on Westheimer near the dry cleaners, I said. Use that. Samuel folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. He stood up, smoothed the front of his trousers, and picked up the empty coffee mug I had left on the corner of the desk, taking it back to the kitchen the way he had taken things back to the kitchen for 31 years. At the door he paused with his hand on the frame. Mr. Pendleton. He said, his voice low and rough, with something he wasn't going to name out loud. We're going to be all right. I know, I said. He left. I turned back to the window. Through the glass, I could see Eleanor's car pulling into the driveway, her garden club tote bag visible through the windshield. She stepped out in a cream-colored blouse, laughing at something on her phone, free-handed and unbothered, completely certain of the world she had arranged around herself. And from the corner of the window, I could just make out the yellowing leaves of the fig tree. The man arrived on a Tuesday. I heard the doorbell from my study, 2 short rings the way people ring when they believe they are expected and welcome. I heard Eleanor's heels on the hardwood in the foyer, heard the warmth that came into her voice when she opened the door. That particular warmth she deployed like a tool whenever she needed someone to feel comfortable before she needed something from them. Dr. Moss, thank you so much for coming, she said. He's having a good day, I think. Well, good for him. I pressed my back against the chair and let my shoulders drop. My hands resting in my lap began their familiar tremble. By the time Eleanor knocked twice and opened the study door, I had arranged myself into the picture of a man gently losing his grip on the world eye's slightly unfocused posture, softened the faint crease of confusion pulling at the corners of my mouth. Dr. Harlan Moss was somewhere in his late 50s with a neatly trimmed gray beard and rimless glasses that gave him the appearance of competence without the burden of having to actually demonstrate it. He carried a slim leather folder and wore an expression of practiced compassion, the kind that sits on the face like a mask that fits well enough to fool people who aren't looking too closely. I was looking very closely. Arthur, Eleanor said, her voice dropping into its softest register. This is Dr. Moss. He just wants to have a little conversation with you. You remember we talked about this? I blinked slowly. Is he the one from the insurance? I asked, letting my voice come out thin and uncertain. Eleanor's expression tightened at the corners, just enough for a man who had been watching faces for 3 decades to catch. And then she smiled with great gentleness. No, sweetheart. He's a doctor. He's here to help. Dr. Moss settled into the chair across from me and opened his folder. He had a yellow sheet on top, pre-printed questions I noted in a font size that suggested they had been prepared for easy reading, rather than for the flexibility a genuine clinical assessment requires. A real neurological evaluation has room for improvisation. It follows the patient. It listens. What Dr. Moss had in front of him was a checklist. Arthur, he said, with the warm, slightly louder cadence people use with the very young and the very old. Can you tell me today's date? Oh, I let my brow furrow. I looked at the window, then at the ceiling, then back at him, as if the date were a thing I was searching for in the furniture. Is it Thursday? I said, and let my voice carry the particular waver of a man who is embarrassed by his own uncertainty. It was Tuesday. He wrote something down. And do you know who the current president is? I named the wrong one. Not absurdly wrong, not a name from 40 years ago. Just wrong enough to be consistent with someone in the middle stages of decline. He wrote something down again. He had not yet looked up from his paper. That was the thing that confirmed it for me. A physician conducting a genuine cognitive assessment watches the patient. He watches the eyes, the posture, the micro-expressions, the way the hands move when the mind is searching. Dr. Moss was watching his checklist. Every question he asked was the next question on the list. He did not deviate once. He did not follow up on any of my answers. He simply collected them like a man filling out a form he had already decided how to complete. Julian appeared in the doorway halfway through, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed and his face arranged into something approximating filial concern. "How's he doing?" he asked, directing the question at Eleanor rather than at me, as if I were a car being appraised, and it would be odd to ask the car directly. "He's doing his best," Eleanor said, and she placed her hand on my arm with a tenderness that made my stomach turn. I looked up at Julian. I let my eyes go soft and slightly lost. "Jules," I said, my voice brightening with the fragile delight of a man who has just recognized someone he feared he might forget. "When did you get here?" Julian's jaw flexed once. Something moved behind his eyes, not guilt, not quite. It was more complicated than guilt. It was the expression of a man who has told himself a story about what he is doing and is momentarily confronted with the gap between the story and the thing itself. Then the expression closed the way a shutter closes, and he smiled at me with practiced warmth. "Just got here, Pop. Just checking in on you." That's good," I said vaguely. "That's good, son." He looked away first. Dr. Moss concluded his assessment 40 minutes after he began it. He shook Eleanor's hand at the door and told her in a voice calibrated to carry just far enough for me to hear, without seeming intended for my ears, that he would have the written report to her attorney by the end of the week. Eleanor thanked him in the warm, relieved tone of a woman for whom a burden is finally being lifted. I sat in my study and stared at the window and felt the particular cold of a man who has just watched himself be erased with a yellow checklist and a handshake. That night I waited. At 11:43, the light on my secondary monitor flickered on. The motion-sensitive camera I had installed 18 months ago in the study's upper bookshelf, the one Eleanor had never thought to look for, because it was housed inside the spine of an old legal reference volume she had never once opened, had detected movement. Not in the study. In the hallway outside it, 3 people moving toward the living room. I pulled on my reading glasses, inserted the small earpiece I had kept in my desk drawer for the past 3 weeks, and pressed play. The audio came through clearly. Texas one-party consent law meant that every word spoken in my house, recorded on my system, was mine to keep. I had listened to that recording 4 times before I finally closed the file. Not because I needed to hear it again, because some part of me kept waiting for the words to mean something different on the 4th pass than they had on the 1st. They didn't. They meant exactly what they had always meant. And by the time I shut the laptop and sat in the quiet of Margaret's office, I had accepted that there was no version of what I had heard that left any room for doubt. My hands were trembling, not performing this time, actually trembling with something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, and was in the end the worst combination of both. I took a slow breath, then another. Then I reached for the notebook. The pen moved across the page in my careful, steady hand, not shaking anymore, because the trembling, the real kind, the kind that comes from the gut, I had learned long ago how to take it and turn it into something useful. I wrote one line at the top of the new page. Names, dates, exact words spoken, every syllable. Then I kept writing. The name on the piece of paper was Margaret Hale. I had known about her for years, not personally, but professionally, the way you know about people whose work you respect from a distance. She had spent the first half of her career as a federal public defender in Houston, and the second half in private practice handling exactly the kind of case nobody else wanted to touch. Elder exploitation, contested guardianships, families eating each other alive over money and property, and the remains of people who couldn't fight back anymore. She had a reputation for being relentlessly prepared and almost impossible to rattle. She had also at some point in the late 90s given a lecture at a DOJ training conference that I had attended under a different name, and I remembered thinking that she was the sharpest person in the room. I needed the sharpest person in the room. Samuel made the call from the payphone on Westheimer on a Wednesday morning, while Eleanor was at her Pilates class. He told me afterward that it had taken him 4 minutes to find the right coins and another 30 seconds to remember the number because his hands were shaking so badly he misdialed twice. He was not a man who frightened easily, Samuel. He had worked for me through 2 federal relocations, 1 death threat, and the year after Diana passed, when neither of us was entirely functional. The fact that his hands were shaking told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he was taking this. Margaret called back within the hour from a number I didn't recognize to a cell phone I had purchased for cash at a gas station on Shepherd Drive the week before. She said 4 words before I could introduce myself. "I know who you are." Then you know I don't call unless it's necessary," I said. "What do you need?" "A meeting. Somewhere that isn't my house, isn't your office, and isn't anywhere Eleanor or Julian have ever been." She gave me an address, a small conference room above a Vietnamese restaurant in Midtown that she rented by the hour for exactly this kind of situation. I took a taxi there 2 days later, wearing a baseball cap and a jacket I hadn't worn in 15 years, feeling simultaneously ridiculous and entirely serious about both. Margaret Hale was already seated when I arrived. She was 58 years old, with close-cropped silver hair and the posture of a woman who has spent decades in rooms where posture is a form of argument. She looked at me when I walked in, took in the cap, the old jacket, the deliberate slowness of my walk, and she didn't comment on any of it. She just gestured to the chair across from her and said, "Tell me everything. Start from the first night you noticed the tea." So I did. I talked for 90 minutes. I laid out the timeline, the test results I expected from the lab, where I'd sent the first mug of tea, the gist of the recorded conversation I had captured 2 nights before, and the name of the physician I had looked up after. Eleanor let it slip during a phone call. She thought I wasn't alert enough to process. Margaret wrote continuously, filling 3 pages of yellow legal pad without looking up, only interrupting when she needed precision, exact dates, exact words, the exact location of the camera in the study. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me over the top of her glasses with the particular expression of a lawyer who has just heard something that is simultaneously very bad and very useful. "They signed a facility contract," she said. "I believe so. I haven't confirmed it yet, but the conversation was explicit. If they signed before filing," she started, "then they assumed the outcome before the court made any determination." I finished. "Yes, that's what I intend to prove." Margaret leaned back in her chair and tapped the end of her pen against her legal pad 3 times, a thinking gesture, quick and precise. "I'll take it," she said, "but nobody knows I'm representing you until we're in the courtroom. Not Eleanor, not Julian, not anyone on their side. The moment they find out you have counsel, they'll accelerate the timeline." "Agreed," I said. "One more thing." "Go ahead." "Whatever happens in that courtroom," I said, "I want it done on paper, evidence, documentation. Nothing that relies on anyone believing me over them." Margaret looked at me steadily. "That's the only way I know how to work," she said. I felt something loosen in my chest, something that had been pulled tight for months. Not relief exactly. More like the feeling of stepping onto solid ground after walking on ice for so long that you'd forgotten what solid felt like. My eyes went hot and dry at the corners, and I blinked it back because I was not going to sit in a conference room above a Vietnamese restaurant and fall apart in front of a woman I had just met. "Good," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. That evening, I sat at my desk while Eleanor watched television in the living room and Samuel moved quietly through the kitchen, and I thought about what it meant to conduct an investigation against your own family. In 30 years of federal work, I had built cases against bank executives, hedge fund, managers, political operatives, people who had stolen from strangers and institutions, people whose crimes were enormous but impersonal. What I was doing now was none of those things. It was the most personal thing I had ever done, and it required me to be colder and more precise than I had ever been, because the moment I let the grief in the grief would eat the evidence. So I kept it out. I compartmentalized it the way I had always compartmentalized the parts of the work that would break you if you let them sit too close to the surface. 3 days later, a technician I trusted came to the house while Eleanor was at lunch, and Julian was, as usual, somewhere unspecified. He spent 40 minutes in the study and left without speaking to anyone except me. The camera in the legal volume now had audio activation. Any voice in that room would trigger the recording. The footage would upload automatically to an encrypted server Margaret had set up under a case number that existed nowhere in her firm's official files. That night, after Eleanor set my tea and went upstairs, Samuel came to the kitchen, poured the pot down the drain, and refilled it from the tin in the back of the pantry. He brought the fresh cup to my study on the old silver tray, the one with the etching of the Houston skyline that Diana had given us as a wedding gift, and set it on the corner of the desk. "Clean," he said, which was the word we had agreed on. One word, no elaboration needed. "Thank you, Samuel," I said. He straightened up, and I noticed the way his shoulders had changed over the past 2 weeks, less of the careful, contained tension he'd been carrying since I told him about the tea, and more of the steadiness that comes from a man who has decided what side he is on and made peace with what that costs. He looked older and more solid at the same time, if that makes any sense, like a tree that has survived a hard season. He walked to the door. At the threshold, he turned back and his voice was low and rough, with the kind of emotion that a man like Samuel only ever lets out in small, controlled doses. "She's not going to win, Mr. Pendleton. I won't let her." My throat tightened. I pressed my lips together and nodded once. "Neither will I," I said. He left. I picked up the clean cup of tea Earl Grey, 1 sugar, exactly as I had always taken it, and I drank it slowly in the dark and quiet of my study, while the camera in the bookshelf blinked its small red light steady and patient, waiting for whatever came next. The red light blinked on at 11:47. I was still at my desk. I had not been sleeping well, which was the one genuine symptom I could not fully separate from the performed ones when the secondary monitor flickered to life. The audio activation system Margaret's technician had installed used a simple threshold trigger, 2 or more distinct vocal frequencies in the study, for more than 3 seconds. What I was seeing now meant that someone, more than one someone, had walked into my study on the other side of the house. My study, my desk, the room where I had spent 30 years building the kind of files that ended careers and opened prison doors. My jaw tightened until I felt it in my back teeth. I put in the earpiece, kept the monitor dim, and pressed play. The audio was clean, better than I expected. Honestly, the microphone in the book spine picked up the room, with the kind of clarity that made the voices feel close enough to touch. Eleanor first the sound of the leather chair behind my desk, accepting her weight. Victor says the petition draft is ready. We just need to confirm the physician's report is finalized before we file. A pause. The soft sound of someone setting a glass down on the side table. Then Victor Sloane's voice, the first time I heard it in full, not filtered through a door or a phone call, but direct and unguarded in a room where he believed he had nothing to hide. It was a voice built for conference rooms and closing arguments, rich and unhurried, the voice of a man who had been told he was persuasive so many times that he had stopped questioning it. The report will be ready Thursday, Victor said. Moss signed off on the assessment this afternoon. The language is airtight progressive cognitive impairment, inability to manage financial affairs, poses a risk to himself without supervised care. He paused. It reads well. It should, Eleanor said, and there was something in her tone, flat, almost bored, that turned my stomach. Not rage, not triumph. Just the matter-of-fact satisfaction of a woman crossing items off a list. Julian's voice came from somewhere near the window, restless pacing. What happens if he gets a lawyer? If someone files a response on his behalf? Neulo speaks his adas stambursis. He won't, Eleanor said. You don't know that... Julian. Eleanor's voice sharpened just enough to cut through his. He doesn't know what day it is half the time. He called me Diana last week. My hands curled slowly into fists on the desk in front of me. She was right that I had called her Diana. It was the only lie I had told that actually cost me something, using my first wife's name. Letting it fall from my mouth in Eleanor's presence, as though I had confused the two women, as though the woman I had loved for 30 years had simply dissolved into whoever happened to be standing in her place. It had tasted like ash, and Eleanor had believed it completely. He called me Diana. Eleanor repeated softer now, with something that almost sounded like pity, which was somehow worse than the coldness. He doesn't have the capacity to retain legal counsel. That's the entire point. Victor's chair shifted. Even if he did manage to reach someone, the evaluation is on record, the petition is properly filed, we have a court date. What could he present that outweighs a licensed physician's assessment? Nothing, Eleanor said. That's why we used Moss. I wrote that down, word for word. Julian crossed the room. I could track him by sound now, the slight uneven rhythm of his walk, something he'd had since a knee injury in his 20s. He stopped near the bookshelves. My bookshelves. The ones full of case files and legal references and 30 years of a career he had never once asked me about. What about the asset transfers? He asked. If the petition goes through, how quickly can we... That's not a conversation for tonight, Eleanor said, and the finality in her voice closed the subject like a locked door. One step at a time. I just want to know what the timeline looks like. Julian pressed, and I could hear the anxiety bleeding through his attempt at composure, the slightly too fast cadence, the way he had always spoken when he was scared of something and trying not to show it. When he was 8 years old, that voice had broken my heart every time I heard it. Sitting in the dark with an earpiece in it broke something different. Something I hadn't known was still whole. The timeline. Victor said, with the patient precision of a man explaining something to someone who should already understand it, is that once guardianship is granted, Julian has immediate authority over financial decisions. The transfers can begin within 72 hours of the judge's order. The facility has already confirmed the room. The contract signed, Julian asked. It's signed 3 weeks ago, Eleanor said. Private wing building B, no external visitors without family authorization. He'll be comfortable. It's a good facility. She said it with such equanimity. He'll be comfortable, as though comfort were the point. as though the man she was planning to deposit in a locked private wing was a piece of furniture being placed in storage rather than the person whose name was still on the deed of the house she was sitting in. Something hot and terrible moved up through my chest and into my throat, and I had to set down the pen and press both palms flat on the desk and breathe through it. Not grief, not yet. Something rawer than grief, the specific anguish of hearing your own son stand in your study at midnight and say nothing, nothing at all, while your wife described putting you away. Because that was what Julian did. For a full 40 seconds after Eleanor said, "He'll be comfortable," my son said nothing. He did not object. He did not qualify. He did not say, "Wait," or "Is this really what we want?" Or "What if he's not as far gone as we think?" He said, Okay, yeah. What do I need to sign?" I picked up the pen again. My hand was steady. That steadiness was costing me something I couldn't name, something I would have to pay for later, in some private accounting that didn't involve either of them. "There are 3 documents," Victor said, and I heard the familiar crinkle of papers being unfolded. The conservatorship authorization, the asset management proxy, and the facility admission agreement. All 3 need your signature before we file Monday. The sound of pages turning, the scratch of a pen. My son's pen, signing the papers that would end my life as I had lived it. I kept writing. Dates, times, exact language, every word that had been said in my study by people who forgot or never knew that a man who spent 30 years catching liars had learned to document everything before he ever moved to act on it. At 12:31, they left. I heard the study door close, heard footsteps move down the hall, heard the faint sound of Eleanor's bedroom door, and then the house settled back into the silence it wore at night. I pulled the earpiece out and set it on the desk. My chest hurt with the particular deep ache of something that has been held under pressure for too long. My eyes burned dry and hot in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. I thought about the 8-year-old boy with the uneven gait who used to fall asleep in the back seat of my car on the drive home from Little League Head, tilted against the window, completely trusting that I would get him home safe. I thought about that boy signing papers at midnight. Then I closed the notebook, encrypted the audio file, uploaded it to Margaret's server, and sent her a message that said, "Only room recording. All 3 present, full conversation captured. Call me in the morning." I stood up from the desk, and my legs felt uncertain beneath me for just a moment. Not performance, not age, just the physical weight of what I was carrying. I steadied myself against the desk edge, took one slow breath, and then walked to the window. Outside, the Houston night was warm, and still the oak trees in the yard throwing long shadows across the lawn under the streetlight. Somewhere out there beyond the neighborhood, beyond the city, there was a courthouse with a docket and a date and a room where all of this would eventually have to be settled. I had 8 months to make sure I was ready for it. I went to bed. I did not sleep well, but I went. The hardest performance I ever gave wasn't in a federal courtroom. It was in my own living room, in my own chair, pretending not to know who I was. Dr. Harlan Moss arrived on a Thursday morning with a slim leather folder and the expression of a man who had already written the conclusion and was simply collecting the paperwork to support it. Eleanor welcomed him at the front door, with both hands extended. Her voice dropping into the register she reserved for situations that required trust to be manufactured quickly. Warm, slightly breathless, grateful in the precise way that makes people feel needed, without making them feel suspicious. "He's having a difficult morning," she said, leading Moss down the hall. "But he tries so hard. That's what breaks my heart." She hadn't spoken to me that morning. She had set my breakfast on the table and gone upstairs. The trying and the broken heart were additions for the audience. I heard them coming and arranged myself. By the time the living room door opened, I had settled into the chair by the window, the one with the worn armrest where I had spent 30 years reading case files that no one outside the department was ever supposed to see. I let my shoulders drop. I let my hands rest loose in my lap. I let my eyes go to the window and stay there a beat too long, the way a man's eyes go, when his mind has lost its grip on the present moment and drifted somewhere slower. Dr. Moss sat across from me and opened his folder. The first thing I noticed was that he did not look at me. He looked at the top sheet, a pre-printed form, questions numbered in sequence spaces for responses below each one. I had seen forms like that before, though never in a clinical setting. I had seen them in administrative proceedings in situations where the outcome had been determined before the process began, and the process existed only to generate a document. A real cognitive assessment doesn't look like a form. It looks like a conversation that keeps changing direction because the physician is following the patient, not the paper. A real neurologist watches the hands. He watches the breathing. He watches the space between when a word is asked for and when it fails to come. because that space tells you things no checkbox can record. Dr. Moss was watching his clipboard. Arthur, he said, with the particular volume people use when they have decided in advance that the person in front of them cannot hear. Well, can you tell me what today's date is? I let my brow crumple. I moved my eyes from the window to the ceiling, then to the carpet, then back to his face, the searching gaze of a man looking for something in the furniture that the furniture cannot give him. Is it? I let my voice trail into uncertainty. Thursday? I think it might be Thursday. It was Thursday. He wrote something down before I finished speaking. That was the second thing I noticed. He wrote before I finished. A physician conducting a genuine assessment listens to the complete answer because sometimes the most important information arrives in the final 3 words. Dr. Moss had already decided what my answer meant before it ended. He moved through his list: the year, the sitting president, my address, my date of birth. I gave him a wrong answer each time, not the same kind of wrong, because consistency in error is its own kind of tell, and I was not going to make that mistake. Each wrong answer came from a different direction. One was close, but off by a year. One was confidently incorrect. One dissolved into a trailing silence that suggested the word had simply ceased to exist, in a mind that could no longer hold it. Eleanor sat to my left, close enough that I could smell the jasmine she had worn since the first year of our marriage. She placed her hand on mine twice each time, with the practiced tenderness of a woman who understood that the gesture needed to read as instinctive rather than staged. "Take your time, sweetheart," she murmured after I stumbled on the year. I looked up at her when she said that. Just for a moment, long enough for her to see my face, not long enough for her to read what was behind it. Julian was in the doorway. He had been there for approximately 8 minutes, arms folded, expression arranged into something that, from a distance, resembled filial concern. He looked at Eleanor rather than at me, the way a person looks at the translator rather than the speaker, because I had become someone whose words required interpretation by someone more reliable. I gave him the soft eyes, the tentative half-smile of a man who sees his son and is glad but cannot quite retrieve the reason why. Julian smiled back. It was a good smile. He had learned it from me. He looked away first. He always looked away first. Dr. Moss concluded 40 minutes after he began. He shook Eleanor's hand in the foyer, their voices dropping to a register calibrated to carry just far enough the performance of privacy rather than privacy itself. I caught the shape of it without the words, the nod, the folder, closing the quiet finality of a man delivering a verdict he had carried in when he arrived. I returned to my chair. I looked at the window. Outside, the November light was flat and pale across the back garden, and the fig tree Eleanor had planted last spring was dropping its last leaves in slow, uneven intervals, the way things drop when nobody is paying attention to them anymore. That evening, my phone rang. Margaret's voice was steady as it always was, but beneath the steadiness, something had been sharpened to a fine point. "I pulled Harlan Moss's licensing records," she said. "His Texas certification expired 14 months ago. His Ohio license was suspended in 2019 ethical violations, falsifying patient records in an unrelated case. He has been operating without valid licensure in this state for over a year." I sat with that for a moment. "The evaluation is legally void," she said. "A physician without valid licensure cannot conduct a court-recognized capacity assessment in Texas. Everything he signed carries no legal weight." She paused. "There's one more thing. I found the facility contract." "Tell me." "Eleanor signed it 3 weeks ago, before Moss set foot in your house, before any evaluation was conducted, before any court had been asked to make any determination about your capacity." Her voice did not change in tone, but something in it settled the particular gravity of a lawyer who has just found the document that changes the shape of everything. "She signed a contract placing you in a private care facility before she had any legal basis to do so." The words landed in my chest with the cold weight of something confirmed rather than discovered. I had suspected. Now I knew. "She assumed the outcome," I said. "She did," Margaret said, "and I have the paper that proves it." After I ended the call, I sat for a long time in the dim quiet of my study, the phone still warm in my hand. Through the window I could see the last light going out of the sky above the oaks. The fig tree stood at the edge of the garden, leafless now, its bare branches dark against the pale evening. Eleanor had planted it in the spring. She had carried it from the nursery herself, set it in the soil. Herself watered it for 3 weeks without asking Samuel for help. She had said she wanted to tend to something growing. I thought about that. I thought about what it means to tend to something you are planning to leave. Then I opened the notebook and wrote 2 words at the top of a new page. Add it. There is a kind of grief that doesn't arrive all at once. It comes the way water finds its way through stone, slowly without announcement, until one morning you press your hand against the wall and realize the damage was never on the surface. Margaret sent the file on a Tuesday. I opened it at my desk after Samuel had cleared dinner, and Eleanor had gone upstairs, and I read through it the way I had read through 1,000 files over 30 years methodically, without flinching, starting at the beginning and not stopping until the end. Julian's financials were worse than I had expected. $340,000 in outstanding debt gambling losses across 4 states. 2 personal loans from private lenders, charging rates that suggested Julian had not been in a position to negotiate, and a civil lawsuit from a former business partner, alleging breach of contract and misappropriation of funds. The lawsuit was 18 months old. Julian had never mentioned it. Not once. Not even in passing, not even in the way a man mentions something that is troubling him, without quite wanting to explain why. I set those pages aside and picked up the next section. This was the recording Margaret had found not from my camera, but from a phone call Julian had made 6 months before Eleanor ever put anything in my tea. 6 months before. The timestamp was clear. Julian had called Victor Sloan's direct line on a Saturday afternoon, and Victor apparently operating under the assumption that a conversation between a potential client and a lawyer was private enough to be unguarded had not been careful. I put in the earpiece. Julian's voice came through first, tighter than the version I had been hearing at family dinners, stripped of the social coding, down to something more essential and more frightened. There has to be a way to do this that doesn't involve him dying. A dead man's estate goes through probate. That could drag on for years, and I don't have years. Victor measured, "What are you proposing?" "An incompetency petition," Julian said, and the casualness with which he said it, the way a man might say, "Let's try the fish," made the breath leave my body. If he's declared unfit, the guardian controls everything immediately. No waiting, no court oversight of the estate. "That's a significant legal step," Victor said. "I know what it is." Julian's voice tightened further. "I also know what happens to me financially if I don't get ahead of this before he decides to change the will again. He's already moved money around twice in the last year. I can't. I need this resolved." A pause. Then Victor, "You need a medical basis, a physician willing to document cognitive decline." "I know someone who can find us a doctor," Julian said, and that was all. I pulled the earpiece out. My chest was doing something I didn't have a clean word for not breaking, because I had been preparing for this, in the way you prepare for a surgery you know is coming. But still, the actual moment of the cut is different from knowing the cut will happen. My hands were pressed flat on the desk, and I could feel my pulse in my palms, which I had not felt since the worst days of the Meridian investigation, when we thought we had lost the key witness, and 30 months of work might come apart overnight. I thought about Julian at 8 years old. He had been a serious child, not somber, not unhappy, but thoughtful in the way that makes a parent proud, and slightly worried in equal measure. He used to come to my study on Saturday mornings and sit in the corner chair with a book, while I worked, not asking for anything, just wanting to be in the same room. I used to pretend not to notice how often he looked up from his book to watch me. I understood it. After Diana died, I think he needed to see me continuing to function. He needed proof that the world had not actually stopped, even though it felt like it had. I had tried to give him that proof every day for the 5 years between Diana's death and my marriage to Eleanor. Apparently, it had not been enough. I opened the notebook. My hand ached with the effort of keeping it steady, not trembling the way I performed. Trembling but tight, controlled the way a fist is tight before it opens. I wrote the date at the top of a new page. Then I wrote Julian's name. Then I wrote the date of Victor's phone call, the exact words, every syllable. When I finished, I set down the pen and picked up the phone. Margaret answered on the second ring. "I heard it," I said. "I know," she said. Her voice was quiet, careful, the voice of someone who understood that what I had just listened to was not merely evidence. "He started this," I said. "Not Eleanor. Julian started this." "Yes," Margaret said. "The call predates Eleanor's involvement by 6 months. He brought her the plan, not the other way around." My throat tightened until it hurt. I pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of my nose and breathed through it. "I need a new will drafted," I said. "Everything changes." Margaret went very still on the other end of the line. "How much changes?" "Everything," I said. Through the study window, I could see Julian's car pulling into the driveway, his headlights sweeping across the front of the house. He stepped out, looked up at the lit window of my study, and raised one hand in a casual wave. The wave of a man who has nothing to hide, or who has hidden things for so long that the hiding has become invisible even to himself. I raised my hand back. My heart felt like something wrung out and left to dry, But my face was composed and my eyes were steady, and when Julian disappeared through the front door below me, I turned back to the desk and kept writing. I had expected greed. What I hadn't expected was the scale of it, or how long it had already been going on before I thought to look. Margaret spread the documents across the conference table on a Wednesday afternoon 4 months before the hearing, and she did it the way she did everything methodically, without theater, each page placed in sequence like evidence at a crime scene, which was exactly what it was. 3 shell companies, she said, tapping the first stack of papers with her pen. All registered in Delaware, all under third-party names with no visible connection to Eleanor. But the registered agent address for all 3 is the same office building on Post Oak Boulevard. She paused. Victor Sloan's building. I looked at the pages. My reading glasses were on the table beside me, and I put them on slowly and studied the corporate filings the way I had studied corporate filings 30 years ago, when the numbers in them represented other people's crimes. The feeling was not entirely different now. It was just personal in a way it had never been before, and personal makes everything heavier. When did the transfers start? I asked. 6 years ago, Margaret said. Approximately 14 months after your marriage to Eleanor. Something moved through my chest, not surprise because I had stopped being surprised several weeks ago, but a cold, settling recognition. She had started within the first year. Before she had finished unpacking her things in the bedroom that had been Diana's, she had already started building the architecture of the theft. It's show me the amounts, I said. Margaret turned to the next page. The numbers were laid out in a clean table, dates, amounts, destination accounts. My eyes moved down the column of figures and my jaw tightened with every line. Transfers from the family trust. Transfers from the investment portfolio. 3 properties that had been quietly refinanced and the equity extracted through a subsidiary of one of the shell companies. The total at the bottom of the page had 7 digits. 4.2 million, I said. As of last month, Margaret said. Some of it is still in the intermediate accounts, but approximately 1.8 million has already cleared to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I set the page down. My hands were very still. I had learned a long time ago that the moments when your hands most want to shake are the moments when you cannot afford to let them. Victor, I said. Victor, Margaret confirmed. He's been to the Caymans 4 times in the last 2 years, Eleanor twice. The account is registered to one of the Delaware companies, but the signature authority belongs to a name I've seen on Victor's firm letterhead as a junior associate. She's moving the money through him, I said. She's been moving the money through him for 6 years, Margaret said. And there's a flight booking. She slid the next page across the table. 2 one-way tickets, Victor Sloan and Eleanor Pendleton, Grand Cayman, dated 3 days after your hearing. I stared at the booking confirmation. My throat tightened so sharply it hurt to swallow. 3 days after the hearing. She had already bought the tickets. She had already decided when she was leaving. The guardianship petition, the facility contract. The physician's evaluation. All of it was not just about controlling my assets. It was about buying herself enough time to finish moving everything before she disappeared entirely. Julian, I said, is his name on any of the offshore accounts? Margaret shook her head. Nowhere. Julian's financial activity is entirely domestic. He's in debt, he's desperate, but he has no access to what Eleanor has been building offshore. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. My eyes burned with a dryness that had nothing to do with the air in the room. Julian had lit the fuse believing he was the one holding the dynamite. He had no idea Eleanor was standing behind him with an entirely different detonator. He thought he was going to get paid, I said. He thought he was going to get control of your estate, Margaret said carefully. What Eleanor was actually planning was to use the guardianship window to complete the transfers and leave. Julian would have been the legal guardian of a man with no assets. The specific cruelty of it landed on me all at once, not anger this time, but something quieter and more devastating. My son had betrayed me for money that was never going to be his. He had been used as thoroughly as I had, just in a different direction, and the bitter irony of it didn't make me feel better about either of us. He doesn't know, I said. Not yet, Margaret said. I thought about whether to tell him. I thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. Leave it, I said. If he finds out before the hearing, it becomes unpredictable. Let the courtroom do it. Margaret nodded. I've passed the financial files to a contact at the DA's office. Financial Crimes Division. They've been building a parallel case on the wire transfers for 6 weeks. They may want to be present at the hearing. And let them, I said. The more documentation in that room, the better. I gathered the pages and slid them back into the folder Margaret had prepared. My movements were deliberate, controlled the movements of a man who is not going to allow his hands to betray what is happening inside his chest. Margaret watched me and said nothing, which was one of the things I had come to appreciate most about her. "How much more do we need?" I asked. "We have enough," she said. "But I want Samuel's samples verified by an independent lab before the hearing. Chain of custody needs to be clean all the way through." "I'll arrange it," I said. That evening I drove home in a taxi, still no personal vehicle, still no traceable movement, and I walked into the house to find Eleanor in the kitchen, arranging flowers in the blue vase she had bought the previous spring, humming something quiet and content to herself. She looked up when I came in, and her face opened into the warm, practiced expression of a wife pleased to see her husband home. "There you are," she said. "I was starting to wonder." "Just tired," I said, and let my shoulders drop the way a tired old man's shoulders drop. She came over and pressed her cool hand briefly to my cheek, a gesture of tenderness so well executed that if I hadn't spent 8 months studying her, I might almost have believed it. "Go sit down," she said. "I'll bring your tea." I nodded and shuffled toward the study. Behind me, I heard her filling the kettle, humming again. $4.2 million and 2 one-way tickets, and she was humming. I sat down at my desk, opened the notebook, and kept building the case that was going to take everything she had built apart piece by documented piece. 20 minutes later, Samuel knocked softly and came in without waiting. His face was doing something I had not seen it do before, a controlled urgency, the look of a man delivering information he does not want to be delivering. "There's a car," he said low and tight. "Black sedan, parked across the street for the past 2 hours. I've been watching it from the kitchen window. The engine's been off the whole time, but there's someone in the driver's seat." My pen stopped moving. "Not police. Not police," Samuel said. "Police cars have a way of sitting. This is different. This is someone watching." I looked at him steadily. "Pack a bag," I said. "Small, just what you can carry fast." Samuel's eyes widened a fraction, the only sign of alarm he allowed himself. "Tonight? Not tonight," I said, "but soon, when I tell you. Be ready." He gave a single tight nod and left. I turned back to the window, to the dark street beyond the glass, to the black car sitting patient and still under the oak trees. I picked up my pen and finished the sentence I had been writing. The cemetery was the one place Eleanor never went. She had said so early in our marriage. We had driven past the Pendleton family plot on the way back from a dinner with friends, and she had looked out the window at the iron gate and said with a small, precise shudder that she found graveyards oppressive. I had not commented on it at the time. I had simply filed it away in the part of my mind that cataloged useful information for no particular reason. As it turned out, there was a reason. There always is. Margaret and I arrived at the Pendleton family cemetery at 11:15 on the night before the hearing. The rain had started 2 hours earlier, not the full storm that would arrive by morning, but its advance guard, a steady cold curtain of water that turned the cemetery's gravel path into a shallow river and soaked through my coat before we reached the gate. Margaret had brought a small flashlight. I had brought a folding spade in the box. "You're sure about this?" Margaret said, pulling the gate open. The hinges groaned and the sound moved through the wet dark like something alive. "Eleanor hasn't set foot in this place in 15 years, I said. "It's the one location she would never think to search." I shifted the box under my arm. "Besides, it feels right." Margaret looked at me for a moment, over the beam of the flashlight, that measuring look. She had the one that meant she was deciding whether to push back or let me have the thing I'd said. She let me have it. She turned toward the path and said, "Then let's get it done before the ground gets any softer." We walked in single file between the headstones. The Pendleton plot was at the back of the cemetery, sheltered by 3 old live oaks that Diana had loved specifically because they stayed green year-round. She had said once that she found it comforting, the idea of something alive and permanent standing over the place where a person rests. I had teased her about it at the time, the way you tease someone you love for having a feeling you secretly share. We stopped at her grave. Margaret held the light steady and looked away toward the tree line, and I understood that she was giving me a moment that she would not name or acknowledge, because naming it would make it smaller, and Margaret understood what things needed room to be. Diana Eleanor Pendleton. Beloved wife and mother. The letters were clean, the stone still pale against the dark earth. I had chosen the stone myself, granite from a quarry in Vermont, because Diana had spent one summer in Vermont before we met, and had talked about the color of the stone there, the way it held light differently than Texas stone, cooler and more permanent looking. I crouched down beside the base of the nearest oak, where the roots had lifted the soil just enough to create a natural declivity, a shallow hollow that I had noticed on my last visit 3 weeks ago when I had come alone to think and to measure. I pressed my hand into the soil. Soft. Workable. Here, I said. I began to dig. The folding spade was small, and the work was slow, and the rain came down steadily on my back and on the box beside me and on Diana's headstone, and I was aware of all of it with a particular heightened clarity. The cold, the weight of the wet earth, the smell of rain on old stone, the sound of the oaks moving in the wind above me. There are moments in a life that press themselves into memory differently than other moments, not because they are dramatic, but because every sense is fully present at once. This was one of those moments. "Margaret," I said while I dug. "Yes. If something goes wrong tomorrow, nothing's going wrong tomorrow," she said with a firmness that left no space for the sentence to continue. "Humor me," I said. "If something goes wrong, the server password is in the notebook in my top drawer coded as a phone number. The second and fourth digits are transposed." "I know," she said. "You told me 3 weeks ago." "I know I did," I said. "I'm telling you again." She exhaled not quite a sigh, more the breath of a woman who is both exasperated and deeply fond of the person exasperating her. "Arthur, I have been practicing law for 30 years. I have not lost a client yet to a guardianship petition. I am not planning to start tomorrow." I lowered the box into the hollow. It fit perfectly. I had measured it twice with the particular care of a man who learned early that the difference between a good plan and a failed one is usually a measurement someone didn't bother to take. I began to fill the earth back over it, tamping it down, gently smoothing the surface until it looked undisturbed. "She won't come here," I said, more to myself than to Margaret, more to the stone than to either of us. "No," Margaret agreed. "She won't." I pressed my palms flat against the earth for just a moment, a gesture I hadn't planned and couldn't entirely explain. Then I stood up my knees, protesting the way they always did in the cold, and I looked at Diana's headstone one last time. "I'm sorry it took me this long to see it," I said very quietly. "I should have been paying better attention from the beginning." The rain answered. The oaks moved. I turned and walked back toward the gate without looking back, because looking back is the kind of thing that costs you, and I could not afford anything else to cost me tonight. We took separate taxis home. I walked into the house at 12:40, slipped off my muddy shoes at the door, and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. On the kitchen counter, held down by the salt shaker, was a small folded piece of paper. I recognized Samuel's handwriting before I finished unfolding it. He had a very particular cursive compact upright, the handwriting of a man who had learned it from a teacher who believed penmanship was a form of character. The note said, "Don't look for me. I'll be where I need to be. Trust the process, sir. S." My throat closed so suddenly and so completely that I had to press the back of my hand against my mouth. My eyes went hot and then wet, actually wet the first time in 8 months. And I stood in my kitchen at 12:40 in the morning with mud on my trousers and rain in my hair, and I let myself have 30 seconds of it. 30 seconds of the grief and the gratitude and the particular ache of knowing that the person standing most steadfastly between you and destruction is not your child or your spouse, but your employee of 31 years, who has never once asked you for anything except to be trusted. 30 seconds. Then I folded the note, put it in my shirt pocket close against my chest, and went to bed. At 5 in the morning, the alarm I had set 3 weeks ago woke me in the dark. The storm had arrived in full. I could hear it against the windows, the hard drumming rain, the wind moving through the oaks. I dressed quietly. Old trousers, old boots, the heaviest coat I owned. I picked up the folding spade from the hall closet and walked out the front door into the storm without waking Eleanor. The taxi was already waiting. I had arranged it the week before, paid in cash. The cemetery was dark and wild in the storm, the oaks thrashing overhead, the gravel path completely submerged. I found the hollow by feel as much as sight, got down on my knees in the mud and dug. The earth was heavier than the night before, saturated with rain clinging to the spade and to my hands and to the sleeves of my coat. By the time I lifted the box free, I was soaked to the bone and covered in mud from the elbows down. I held the box against my chest the same way I would hold it 2 hours later, walking up the courthouse steps, and I stood over Diana's grave one more time. "All right," I said, "just that, just all right." I walked back to the taxi. The driver, to his considerable credit, did not say a word about the mud. Halfway to the courthouse, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered it. A man's voice, calm and professional. "Mr. Pendleton, My name is Daniel Reeves. I'm an investigator with the Harris County District Attorney's Financial Crimes Division. We've been running a parallel investigation into a series of wire transfers connected to your household accounts. I believe we need to be in the same room this morning. I looked out the window at the rain-blurred city moving past. Which courtroom? I said. 4, he said. I'll see you there, I said, and ended the call. The taxi moved through the storm toward the courthouse, and I held the muddy box in my lap and watched the city wake up around me, and I thought about Diana standing under the live oaks in Vermont in the summer before we met, and I thought about 30 years, and I thought about what it costs to be patient and what it costs to not be, and I decided for perhaps the 100th time since this all began that patience was still the right answer. The courthouse steps came into view through the rain. I told the driver to stop. The courthouse smelled exactly the way I remembered it, floor wax recycled air and the particular brand of institutional quiet that only exists in buildings where people come to have their lives decided by strangers. I had worked adjacent to places like this for 30 years. I had never expected to walk into one as the man on the wrong end of the petition. The security line moved slowly. The officer at the scanner looked at the wooden box on the conveyor belt, mud-streaked water damage at the corners, smelling faintly of wet earth, and his hand moved toward it instinctively. I spoke before he could touch it. Evidence, I said. My voice came out thin and slightly uncertain the way it always did in public now. For my hearing, my lawyer has the paperwork. He looked at me, looked at the box, looked at my coat, which was still damp from the storm outside and carrying a fair amount of cemetery mud on the left sleeve. Something in his expression shifted the particular shift that happens when a person decides that whatever they're looking at is probably more sad than suspicious. Go on through, sir, he said, and waved me forward. Margaret was waiting at the far end of the hall, standing very straight in a charcoal blazer, her silver hair sharp and precise, her reading glasses pushed up on her head like a woman who intended to use them shortly. She looked at me the way she always looked at me, assessing thorough landing on the mud and the wet coat and the box and processing all of it in approximately 2 seconds without changing her expression. Reeves is already here, she said. I know, he called in the taxi. She turned and nodded toward a door to the left, a small conference annex that the courthouse rented to attorneys by the hour. 2 minutes, she said. Then we go in. Daniel Reeves was standing when we entered, which told me something about him. Immediately, a man who stands when others enter a room has usually spent time in environments where that habit was either taught or earned. He was in his early 40s, lean with a kind of economical stillness that investigators develop after years of watching rooms without wanting to be noticed in them. His jacket was dark blue, his badge clipped inside his lapel, rather than on the outside, present but not announced. Mr. Pendleton, he said, and extended his hand. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of a man who does not use physical contact as a performance. I want you to know we've had eyes on the offshore accounts for 6 weeks. Whatever happens in that courtroom today, the financial case doesn't depend on the civil outcome. We have enough to proceed independently. But then why are you here? I asked. Reeves's mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile, more the expression of a man who respects a direct question. Because when your attorney's subpoena crossed our desk 3 months ago, I realized we were looking at the same people from different directions. It made sense to be in the room. He paused. Also, I want to see Eleanor Pendleton's face when the transfers get laid out in open court. Margaret made a sound that might in a less controlled woman have been a laugh. We go in 2 minutes, she said. Reeves, you're in the gallery, 2nd row left side. Don't speak unless the judge addresses you directly. Understood, Reeves said. I looked at him for a moment, this stranger who had been building a parallel case about my wife's crimes, while I had been building one of my own, neither of us knowing about the other until Margaret's subpoena crossed his desk. There was something almost clarifying about it. The machine had been working on multiple tracks at once the way it was supposed to, the way I had spent 30 years helping design it to work. Thank you, I said, for being here. Reeves nodded once. Don't thank me yet, he said. Thank me after. We walked down the hall toward courtroom 4. Through the narrow window beside the door, I could see the room, the petitioner's table where Eleanor sat with Victor, the gallery where Julian had taken his seat in the front row, the clerk arranging papers at the bench. Eleanor's posture was perfect. Her hands were folded. She was saying something to Victor that made him nod with the smooth, unbothered confidence of a man who expected to be finished by lunch. Margaret pushed the door open, and I walked in behind her. Eleanor heard us before she saw us. I watched her head turn at the sound of footsteps. watched her eyes find me and move over me with the practiced assessment of a woman cataloging a threat level, the mud on my coat, the box under my arm, the woman walking beside me that she didn't recognize. Her eyes stopped on Margaret for just a fraction of a second longer than they should have. Then she turned back to Victor and said something I couldn't hear, and Victor glanced over at our table, and his gaze landed on Margaret with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally very alert. Good. Let him be alert. It wouldn't help him. I set the box down at the center of the respondent's table. The mud from the lid left a faint transfer on the polished wood, spreading slowly outward. I didn't apologize for it. I sat down, folded my trembling hands in my lap, and let my eyes go slightly unfocused the way they always did in public. Soft-o a little lost. The expression of a man who was not entirely sure where he was. Julian in the front row of the gallery was staring at his phone. He didn't look up when I came in. He had not looked at me directly since the day he had waved from the driveway, and I had waved back. The clerk called the case. We rose. Judge Harrison entered from the side door robe, moving and took his seat with the brisk efficiency of a man who had done this 10,000 times. He opened the file in front of him, scanned the caption, picked up his pen, and then his eyes moved across the room in the automatic survey that experienced judges perform before any proceeding begins, taking the measure of the space and the people in it. His gaze reached my face and stopped. Not dramatically, not with any outward sign that the gallery could have read. Just a pause the length of a breath held and released, during which something moved behind his eyes that I recognized because I had felt it myself. 8 months ago, standing in my kitchen holding a cup of tea that tasted wrong. The moment of knowing, Eleanor noticed. I saw her notice. Her chin lifted by a fraction of a degree, and her eyes moved from the judge's face to mine, with the quick recalibrating focus of a woman who has just identified a variable she hadn't accounted for. For the first time all morning, her hands so perfectly folded on the table, tightened against each other. Victor Sloan had won 41 of his last 43 cases. I knew this because Margaret had told me, and Margaret told me things like that not to intimidate me, but because she believed in knowing the precise dimensions of every obstacle before you walk toward it. He rose with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never seriously considered the possibility of losing this particular argument, and his voice, when he began, had the smooth, measured cadence of someone who had rehearsed not just the words, but the pauses between them. Your Honor, he said, this is at its core a matter of compassion. The petitioner, Mrs. Eleanor Pendleton, is asking this court to recognize what the medical record has already documented, that her husband of 15 years has experienced a significant and progressive decline in the cognitive function that renders him unable to manage his own financial affairs or make informed decisions about his care. He paused just long enough. She is not asking for herself. She is asking for him. Eleanor pressed her lips together in an expression of pained, loving concern. The performance was excellent. I had lived with it for 8 months, and it still almost worked on me in the abstract, the way a very good forgery still carries the ghost of the real thing. Victor continued for another 4 minutes the physician's evaluation, the documented incidents of confusion, the family's deep and abiding worry. He used the word dignity twice, which I thought was a particularly bold choice given the circumstances. When he sat down, he clicked his pen closed with the satisfaction of a man who has just made an argument he considers airtight. Margaret stood. She did not straighten her jacket or clear her throat or arrange her papers. She simply rose and looked at Judge Harrison with the calm, unadorned directness of a woman who understood that the most persuasive thing she could do was act as though the facts required no selling. Your Honor, she said, the respondent does not dispute that his condition has changed over the past year. What we dispute is why. The petitioner has presented a medical evaluation and filed this petition on the basis of progressive dementia. We will show that the symptoms were chemically induced deliberately over a period of 7 months by the administration of a sedative compound in the respondent's evening tea. She let that land for exactly 1 breath before continuing. We will show that the physician who conducted the capacity evaluation was not legally licensed to practice medicine in Texas at the time he signed his name to those findings. And we will show that the petitioner signed a residential care contract for the respondent 3 weeks before this court was ever asked to make a single determination about his capacity. The room did not erupt. It absorbed the words the way dry ground absorbs the first rain, quickly, completely, with the faint sound of something that had been airless beginning to breathe. Victor was on his feet before Margaret finished her last sentence. Your Honor, these allegations are extraordinary and entirely unsupported. They come with documentation, Margaret said, without raising her voice or turning her head 1 degree in his direction. Everything I've described is in the box the respondent placed before this court. Judge Harrison raised one hand. Victor sat down, his jaw tight, his pen moving against the legal pad in short, sharp strokes that communicated everything he wasn't saying aloud. Ms. Hale, the judge said, proceed. Margaret opened the wooden box. The first item she removed was a sealed envelope laboratory certification, stamped at the top, the kind that independent forensic labs issue when chain of custody has been maintained from collection to analysis. She handed it to the clerk, who examined the seal, noted it intact, and carried it to the bench. Judge Harrison read the top sheet. His expression did not change, but his reading slowed the particular deceleration of a man encountering information that requires him to adjust what he thought he knew. This is a toxicology report, he said. Yes, Your Honor, Margaret said. It documents the presence of lorazepam, a benzodiazepam sedative, in the respondent's blood sample drawn at an independent certified laboratory 6 months ago. The concentration is consistent with regular low-dose administration over an extended period. Lorazepam, I should explain, is a prescription anti-anxiety medication. In therapeutic doses under a doctor's supervision, it is legitimate medicine. Administered without someone's knowledge in their tea over 7 months, it produces exactly the symptoms. I had been displaying the fog, the slowness, the apparent confusion that Dr. Moss had so efficiently documented on his pre-printed checklist. Victor rose again, his voice stripped of its earlier smoothness. Your Honor, a blood test result from months ago doesn't establish how the compound entered the respondent's system. It establishes that it was there, Judge Harrison said, and the flatness in his voice was its own kind of verdict. Sit down, Mr. Sloan. Victor sat. His knuckles were white around his pen. Eleanor beside him had gone very still, not the composed stillness she had arrived with, but a different kind, the stillness of a woman recalculating under pressure, every muscle held precisely in place, because she did not trust what her face would do if she let it relax. Margaret placed the second sealed envelope before the clerk. Your Honor, these are 17 tea samples collected nightly from the respondent's residence over a period of 17 consecutive days. Each sample was collected by a third party, sealed in the respondent's presence, and transferred to investigator Daniel Reeves of the Harris County District Attorney's Financial Crimes Division, whose chain of custody confirmation is attached. Each sample tested positive for the same compound identified in the respondent's blood work. The clerk carried the envelope to the bench. Judge Harrison looked at it, then looked at the back row of the gallery where Reeves sat with his folder on his knee. Posture, easy, expression, professional. Investigator Reeves, the judge said. You verified the transfer of these samples? Reeves stood. Yes, Your Honor. I received 17 sealed vials on the 8th of last month. The seals were intact at time of receipt. The chain of custody documentation is attached to Exhibit 2. Thank you, the judge said, and Reeves sat back down. Judge Harrison turned to Eleanor. His voice was measured, careful, the voice of a man who is not yet pronouncing anything, but is no longer treating this as routine. Mrs. Pendleton, he said, are you aware that your husband's blood work shows the presence of a sedative compound? Eleanor's chin lifted. Her voice came out smooth, controlled only slightly too careful. He has a doctor. Whatever's in his system would have been prescribed by the same physician who submitted the capacity evaluation, the judge said. Eleanor's mouth opened, closed. The answer she had prepared for that question dissolved before she could find it, because the judge had asked the follow-up she hadn't expected, the one that made Dr. Moss's involvement a loop rather than a straight line. Her fingers, perfectly manicured, pressed flat against the table, hard enough that I could see the pressure from across the room. Margaret's hand moved to the box. She lifted out a USB drive in a sealed evidence sleeve and set it on the clerk's desk with the quiet precision of someone placing the last piece of a very long puzzle. Your Honor, she said, I'd like to play a recording. Victor exploded upward. Absolutely not. The judge looked at him. One look. The kind that doesn't require words. Victor sat down hard, and for the first time all morning, his hand shook slightly as he reached for his water glass. What you were about to hear inside that courtroom, I carried it for 6 months, before anyone else knew it existed. Before I take you into that room drop, I'm ready, in the comments. I want to know who is still standing beside me. A note worth keeping: parts of this story are fictional, woven in to give the lesson shape and weight. If this kind of storytelling is not for you, it is perfectly okay to close it here. No story is meant for everyone. The USB drive was no larger than my thumb, but it carried the weight of 6 months of fear, patience, and sleepless nights. Margaret held it up between two fingers, and the fluorescent light above caught its silver casing like a small blade. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my wrists. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying the calm of someone who had spent 30 years inside courtrooms, exactly like this one. "What you are about to hear is an audio recording made inside the Pendleton residence. Under Texas Penal Code, Section 16.02, one-party consent applies. My client, Arthur Pendleton, was present in his own home and consented to this recording. Its authenticity has been verified by the Harris County Digital Forensics Unit chain of custody intact." Victor shot to his feet so fast his chair scraped the floor. His face had gone a shade I could only describe as yellowish gray, the color of a man who suddenly remembers something he cannot take back. "Objection, Your Honor. This evidence was not disclosed in a timely manner under Rule 193. The petitioner has had no opportunity to—" "Mr. Sloan," Judge Harrison's voice dropped 2 registers. "Ms. Hale filed the motion to admit this recording 48 hours ago. Your objection is noted and overruled. Proceed, counselor." Victor sat down. His hand gripped the edge of the table so hard, his knuckles turned the color of old bone. Eleanor touched his arm, not gently but sharply, like she was pressing a mute button on a device that had started making noise at the wrong time. My fingers curled around the armrest of my chair. I kept my breathing slow. The clerk inserted the drive. A crackling sound filled the room, the familiar groan of my old hardwood floor, the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, and then voices. "Victor, just tell me the timeline again." Eleanor's voice, precise, controlled, the same tone she used when managing dinner reservations. "Petition filed in 8 weeks. Moss delivers his evaluation beforehand. Once the court appoints guardianship, we move the assets under the family trust restructure. Arthur never touches a pen again." Victor, flat, transactional, like he was reading from a project brief. Margaret turned toward the bench. "Your Honor, DA Investigator Daniel Reeves has confirmed the timestamp on this recording as 11:47 p.m., approximately 6 months prior to today's hearing." Reeves nodded from the gallery. Without being asked, his jaw set his eyes on Eleanor. The color drained from Eleanor's face so fast, I thought she might pitch forward. Her lips pressed together until they nearly disappeared. She leaned toward Victor and hissed something behind her hand, and whatever she said made Victor's shoulders go rigid as if someone had poured cement down his spine. "Continue playing the recording," Judge Harrison said. "And if he pushes back, Arthur is not stupid." That was a third voice, younger, rougher at the edges. My chest locked. My lungs refused to expand, because I knew that voice. I had heard it at age 7, asking me why the stars looked closer on cold nights. I had heard it at 14, cracking with the awkward pitch of adolescence. I had heard it at 30, calling me Dad across a crowded Thanksgiving table. "Julian." Margaret's eyes found mine across the room. She gave the smallest nod. "Steady, Arthur," and I pressed my feet flat to the floor to keep myself from coming out of my seat. "He won't push back if he can barely hold a thought," Victor answered on the recording. The room erupted. 2 jurors in the gallery, a retired school teacher and a man in a flannel shirt, both leaned forward at exactly the same moment. A court reporter's fingers stuttered. One of Eleanor's associates, a young woman in a navy blazer, dropped her pen and did not reach down to pick it up. Eleanor was on her feet. "Your Honor, this recording is taken completely out of context. My stepson has a habit of speaking hyperbolically when he is under stress, and Victor was simply—" "Mrs. Pendleton." Judge Harrison raised one hand. "You will have your opportunity to respond. Sit down." She sat. But the steadiness she had walked into the courtroom, with that expensive polished steadiness, had cracked open like a fault line, and through the crack, I could see something I had never seen on Eleanor's face in 15 years of marriage, to my son, raw, exposed panic. Margaret clicked the recording off. The room breathed. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "the voice you just heard in the final exchange belongs to Julian Pendleton, the petitioner's son. The DA's office has authenticated this voice via spectrographic analysis against a reference sample obtained with Mr. Julian Pendleton's prior consent during a routine deposition. We will address the full scope of his involvement in the next submission." Judge Harrison wrote something on his legal pad. Then he looked up at Eleanor. "Mrs. Pendleton," he said, "I want you to listen very carefully to what I am about to say." My heart lodged itself somewhere behind my sternum. And then the judge opened his mouth, and Julian walked through the courtroom door. He looked smaller than I remembered, That was the first thought that moved through me when the door opened and Julian stepped inside. Not the anger, not the grief, not the knot of betrayal I had been carrying in my chest for 6 months. Just that. He looked smaller, like something essential had been taken out of him and not replaced. His suit was charcoal gray, the same shade he wore to his mother's funeral 14 years ago. His tie was slightly loose. He had his mother's cheekbones and my father's jawline, and seeing that combination on his face at this moment made my throat clench so tightly I had to swallow 3 times just to breathe. Margaret was the first to move. She stepped toward the bench, voice low but firm. "Your Honor, the respondent requests permission for Julian Pendleton to address the court directly." Victor shot upright. "Objection. Julian Pendleton is not a listed witness. Any testimony from him at this juncture would be procedurally overruled." Judge Harrison did not even look at Victor. His eyes were on Julian, measuring. "Mr. Pendleton, you may approach." Julian walked toward the witness stand, slowly like a man crossing ice he wasn't certain would hold. He gripped the railing when he reached the stand, and I noticed his knuckles went white immediately, the same habit he had as a child, when he was about to confess something he had been hiding. He looked at me. God help me. He looked at me and his eyes went red at the rims before he had said a single word. "My name is Julian Pendleton." He said, his voice ragged at the edges, as if each syllable cost him something physical. "I am Arthur Pendleton's son, and I am here because I need to tell the truth." Eleanor's hand slammed the table. "Julian, don't you dare!" "Mrs. Pendleton." Judge Harrison's voice cracked like a gavel. "One more outburst and I will have you removed from this courtroom. Do I make myself clear?" Eleanor's jaw set so hard I could see the muscles working along the sides of her face. She pressed both palms flat on the table, breathing through her nose, and turned her eyes away from Julian, as if looking at him had become physically painful. Julian exhaled. His hands were trembling on the railing, not slightly but visibly, the kind of trembling that comes from a person holding something enormous, and finally choosing to put it down. 6 months ago, he said, Victor Sloan came to me with a plan. He said my father was deteriorating, that if we waited we'd lose the estate to legal fees, to bad decisions, to people who would take advantage of him. His voice broke on the last phrase, crumbled inward like a wall that had been undermined from below. And I believed him. Or I told myself I did. Margaret stepped forward. "Mr. Pendleton, were you aware of the substance introduced into your father's tea?" Julian's chin dropped. A single tear tracked down the side of his face, and he did not raise a hand to wipe it. "Victor told me it was a mild sedative, that it would just slow him down, that no one would get hurt." The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through every person present. The court reporter's fingers flew. The retired schoolteacher in the gallery pressed a hand over her mouth. Daniel Reeves wrote 3 lines in rapid succession without looking up. My eyes burned, not with anger, with something far harder to name, the particular agony of a parent watching a child. They raised a child they read to and drove to school and sat beside in hospital. Waiting rooms confessed to an act of betrayal so calculated it had a timeline, a physician, and a filing date. "Dad!" Julian looked directly at me. His voice had reduced to something barely above a whisper, fractured at every joint. "I'm sorry. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I'm sorry." My jaw trembled. I pressed my teeth together to hold it still. "Mr. Pendleton," Margaret said gently, but without pausing, "were you aware that the physician who conducted your father's capacity evaluation, Dr. Harlan Moss, was operating on a suspended license at the time?" Julian closed his eyes. "Victor handled the medical side. I signed the referral form. I didn't check his credentials." He pressed one fist against his sternum, as if trying to physically contain something breaking inside his chest. "I should have checked. I should have done 100 things differently." Victor Sloan stood. His voice had lost all professional smoothness. It came out dry, brittle, the voice of a man watching an alibi collapse from the inside. "Your Honor, I must protest this. This unscheduled testimony constitutes a fundamental breach of—" "Mr. Sloan." Judge Harrison looked at him with an expression that made 3 people in the gallery shift backward in their seats. "Sit down." Victor sat, and this time Eleanor did not reach over to touch his arm. Because Eleanor had gone entirely still, her eyes fixed on Julian with an expression I had never seen cross her face in 15 years. Not anger, not calculation, but something colder and more fragile than either. The judge lifted his pen. "Mr. Pendleton," he said to Julian, "I have a few more questions." The name on the license read Harlan T. Moss, M.D., and beneath it, stamped in red ink so dark it looked almost black, were two words that made Victor Sloan grip the edge of the petitioner's table, hard enough to leave fingerprints in the wood. License suspended. Margaret laid the document flat on the evidence table with the deliberate care of a person who had been waiting months to set something down in exactly the right place. Your Honor. She said, her voice steady as poured concrete. The capacity evaluation submitted by the petitioner as Exhibit A was conducted by Dr. Harlan Moss on September the 14th. At that time, Dr. Moss's Texas medical license had been suspended for a period of 11 months following a disciplinary ruling by the Texas Medical Board related to falsified patient records in an unrelated case. She paused, letting the room absorb it. The evaluation is under Texas law entirely without legal standing. Judge Harrison leaned forward over the bench. His reading glasses sat low on his nose, and he peered over them at Victor with an expression that reminded me of the way a man looks at a structural wall he has just discovered is hollow. Mr. Sloan, he said, are you telling this court that you were unaware of the status of Dr. Moss's license at the time you submitted his evaluation as evidence? Victor's throat moved. Your Honor, the petitioner engaged Dr. Moss in good faith based on a referral from... I asked you a yes or no question. Victor's jaw flexed. I was not fully aware of the suspension at the time of submission. Margaret did not raise her voice. She simply reached into the evidence binder and produced a second document. Your Honor, this is an email recovered via court-ordered subpoena dated August 27th, 18 days before Dr. Moss conducted the evaluation. In it, Victor Sloan writes to Eleanor Pendleton, and I quote, Moss is technically suspended, but his report will hold up if we move fast enough. No one checks unless someone forces a discovery. The courtroom inhaled as one. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, not from emotion, I realized, but from the pure reflex of a woman trying to stop something from escaping her face. Her eyes went wide, then flat, then calculated again within the space of 4 seconds. I had lived with that face for 15 years, in family dinners and holidays, and even now watching her machinery recalibrate in real time, I felt something twist in my chest. Not pity, something older and darker than pity. Grief, perhaps, for the family I had believed I had. Furthermore, Margaret continued, not pausing for a breath. The care facility contract, submitted as Exhibit C, the agreement placing Arthur Pendleton under guardianship at Cedarwood Residential Care, is dated September 2nd. That is 12 days before Dr. Moss's evaluation was even conducted. She turned to face the gallery, then back to the bench. The petitioner had already arranged her stepfather's institutionalization before a single medical test was performed. The conclusion was decided before the diagnosis was written. Julian made a sound from the witness stand, not a word, just a short involuntary exhale like a man who has been punched somewhere soft. His head dropped forward, both hands pressed against the railing in front of him, and I could see from across the room that his shoulders were shaking. I didn't know about the contract, he said. His voice cracked on the last word. Victor, I didn't know she'd already signed a contract before Moss even walked into the house. Eleanor turned on him with a ferocity that made the gallery murmur. Julian, stop talking. Mrs. Pendleton. Judge Harrison's voice cut through the room like a blade. You will not speak to the witness. One more attempt to interfere with testimony in my courtroom, and I will hold you in contempt. Are we absolutely clear? Eleanor pressed both lips together so hard they turned white. She nodded once, a single rigid motion, the nod of a woman swallowing something that burned. My eyes stung. I pressed my thumb and forefinger against the bridge of my nose and breathed slowly through my mouth. Margaret glanced at me, a quick professional check, and something in her expression told me to hold on just a little longer. Your Honor, she said, returning her attention to the bench. The respondent moves that Exhibit of the Moss. Capacity evaluation be struck from the record in its entirety, on the grounds that it was produced by an unlicensed practitioner in knowing coordination with the petitioner's counsel. Judge Harrison wrote something long on his legal pad. Motion granted, he said. The Moss evaluation is hereby removed from the evidentiary record. He looked at Victor over his glasses again. Mr. Sloan, I want you to understand that submitting a document of this nature without disclosure of the licensing issue constitutes a serious ethical violation. We will be returning to that subject before this hearing concludes. Victor's face went the color of old ash. He sat with his hands flat on the table, not moving, not speaking, staring at a fixed point somewhere between the evidence table and the floor. And Eleanor. Eleanor turned slowly away from him, as if she were closing a door she had just decided she would never open again. Margaret gathered her papers. Her hands were perfectly steady. Mine were not. Daniel Reeves had been sitting in the third row of the gallery since 8 that morning, and in all that time, he had not shifted in his seat, not checked his phone, not done anything, except to watch the room, the way a man watches a fire he has been paid to contain. He stood now at Margaret's signal and walked to the front with a brown accordion folder under one arm. He moved like someone who had delivered difficult information many times before and had made peace with the weight of it. "But Your Honor," Margaret said, "the respondent calls investigator Daniel Reeves of the Harris County District Attorney's Financial Crimes Division to present supplemental findings related to the petitioner's financial conduct." Victor's head came up fast. "Objection, this witness was not disclosed on the respondent's witness list within the required. He was disclosed 48 hours ago in the supplemental filing, Mr. Sloan, the same filing that contained the recording you tried to block yesterday." Margaret's tone carried no heat. It didn't need to. "Your Honor, the objection is without merit." "Overruled," Judge Harrison said. "Investigator Reeves, please proceed." Reeves opened the accordion folder and placed a series of documents on the evidence table, each one face up, each one organized with the precision of a man who had spent months building toward this moment. Beginning in January of this year, he said in the measured cadence of someone who had rehearsed nothing and needed to rehearse nothing. A series of wire transfers originated from the Pendleton Family Trust account, a joint account held in Arthur Pendleton's name, and were directed to a series of LLCs registered in Delaware. Over a period of 4 months, the total transferred was $4,200,000. My stomach turned over. $4 million. I had known the number from Margaret's earlier brief, but hearing it spoken aloud in a courtroom attached to my name, attached to accounts I had never authorized, the number hit differently. It hit like something physical. The receiving LLCs, Reeves continued, were traced through a multi-state shell company structure. Beneficial ownership of those companies ultimately resolves to one individual. He placed a final document on the table, turned it to face the bench. Victor Sloan. The murmur that moved through the gallery was low and continuous, like the sound a building makes when its foundation shifts. Eleanor's neck went rigid. She turned her head toward Victor with a motion so controlled it looked mechanical. And what passed between them in that half second was not strategy, not calculation. It was pure exposed terror. The terror of two people realizing their architecture has been seen through from the outside. Victor's eyes darted to hers, then away. His hand moved toward his phone on the table, then stopped. Furthermore, Reeves said, producing a second document, the investigation identified a personal relationship between Victor Sloan and Eleanor Pendleton that predates the filing of the guardianship petition by at least 14 months. He looked directly at the bench. Phone records, financial records, and hotel receipts placed them together on 17 separate occasions across Texas and Louisiana during that period. Margaret stepped forward. "Your Honor, under ABA Rule 1.7, an attorney representing a client in legal proceedings cannot have a personal, financial, or romantic interest that creates a material conflict with that representation. Victor Sloan is not only Eleanor Pendleton's attorney, he is the direct beneficiary of the financial scheme that guardianship was designed to enable. The conflict of interest is not incidental. It is structural. It is the entire point." Victor stood. His voice came out high and stripped of its earlier authority, the voice of a man who had prepared for many arguments, but not for this one. "Your Honor, my personal life has absolutely no bearing on the quality or integrity of my representation of—" "Your personal life," Judge Harrison said, with a quietness more devastating than volume, "is listed in that financial record as a direct payee of funds moved out of my respondent's estate without his knowledge or consent." He set his pen down. "Mr. Sloan, you will surrender your bar identification to the clerk of this court at the conclusion of today's session. I am referring your conduct to the State Bar of Texas for immediate ethics review, and I am notifying the DA's office of my findings." Eleanor rose from her seat so abruptly her chair slid back and struck the low railing behind her. "Your Honor, this is entirely circumstantial. This is Victor, and I have a friendship, a long, professional—" "Mrs. Pendleton." Judge Harrison did not raise his voice. He simply looked at her. "Sit down." She sat. Her chest was heaving, her composure finally irreversibly fractured the polished surface I had watched her maintain through 2 hours of devastating testimony, splintering all at once. Her eyes filled, and she pressed two fingers hard against her mouth, and for one moment, one strange and painful moment, she looked not like the woman who had orchestrated the theft of my life, but like someone who had just watched everything she built collapse under her own feet. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt tired and sad and very, very old. Margaret placed her hand briefly on my arm. "Almost there, Arthur," she whispered. I nodded. My throat was too full to answer. Reeves was still standing at the evidence table when the side door of the courtroom opened and Samuel Brooks walked in. Samuel Brooks walked into that courtroom the way he had walked into every room in my house for 22 years, quietly, deliberately, with the particular dignity of a man who understood that his presence itself was a statement. He was 68 years old, and he looked every year of it. His gray suit was pressed sharp at the collar. His right hand gripped a sealed evidence bag, and his left hand was pressed flat against his thigh to stop it from trembling. But I could see the trembling anyway because I had known Samuel since before Julian was born, and I knew what his hands looked like when he was holding something that cost him everything to carry. My throat closed. My eyes burned hot and immediate the way they had not burned since Diana's funeral 14 years ago. "Almost bored," I whispered, and I did not care that Margaret was beside me or that the entire room was watching. He found my face across the courtroom, his chin lifted, and for one suspended moment, the grief and the relief and the love of 22 years passed between us, without a single word, not silence, but something louder than words, the kind of recognition that only exists between people who have kept each other's secrets in the dark. Then he squared his shoulders and walked to the witness stand. Margaret moved immediately. "Your Honor, the respondent calls Samuel Brooks, former household manager of the Pendleton residence. 6 weeks ago, following a credible threat made against Mr. Brooks by the petitioner, the respondent arranged for Mr. Brooks to be placed under coordinated protective custody with the Harris County District Attorney's Financial Crimes Office, where he has remained, along with the sealed evidence in his possession, until this morning." Victor scrambled upright. His voice had entirely lost its courtroom register. It came out thin, almost breathless. "Your Honor, this witness, this individual, was not. The respondent cannot simply produce a witness who has been concealed from the petitioner's counsel for—" "Mr. Sloan." Judge Harrison's patience had clearly reached its geological limit. "Mr. Brooks was listed in the supplemental witness disclosure filed 48 hours ago, the same filing you apparently did not read. Sit down." Victor sat. Eleanor's hand shot out and gripped his forearm, not tenderly, but the way a person grips a ledge when they feel the ground moving beneath them. Margaret approached the witness stand with the sealed evidence bag Samuel had carried in. "Mr. Brooks, can you describe for the court what you are holding?" Samuel's voice came out steadier than his hands. 17 sealed samples of tea, Earl Grey, collected over a period of 6 weeks from the Pendleton kitchen. He paused to clear his throat. "Each sample was collected by me, personally placed in a tamper-evident evidence bag, labeled with the date and time, and stored in a temperature-controlled container kept in my personal vehicle. I transported them to the Harris County Forensics Lab on October the 2nd, in the presence of Investigator Reeves." Reeves nodded from his seat. "Chain of custody confirmed, Your Honor. Receipt logged." "The toxicology results," Margaret said, handing a document to the clerk, "show the consistent presence of lorazepam in 14 of the 17 samples, a benzodiazepine commonly used as a sedative. At the concentrations detected, daily ingestion would produce cognitive slowing, short-term memory impairment, and mood instability. Precisely the symptoms the petitioner described as signs of dementia." Eleanor's composure finally broke open, not in tears, but in something rawer than tears. She shoved back from the table and stood up so fast the water glass in front of her tipped and rolled off the edge, shattering on the floor below. "This is fabricated," she said, her voice cracking and climbing. "Samuel was dismissed from service. He has a personal grievance. This is a vendetta. Your Honor, nothing more than—" "Mrs. Pendleton," the judge's voice was a wall. "Sit down, now." She sat. Her chest was heaving. A strand of her perfectly maintained hair had pulled loose and fallen across her cheek, and she did not fix it, which told me everything about how thoroughly undone she truly was. "Mr. Brooks," Margaret said gently, turning back to Samuel, "why did you leave the Pendleton residence 6 weeks before this hearing?" Samuel looked at his hands. His jaw worked for a moment. Then he looked up at me, directly at me, not at the attorneys, not at the judge, and his eyes went wet at the corners. "Because Mrs. Eleanor told me," he said, his voice dropping to something rough and unsteady. That if I said one word about the tea to anyone, one word, she would make sure I never worked again. That she would tell people I stole from the house. That I would lose everything. He swallowed hard. I've worked my whole life, Mr. Arthur. My whole life. I was scared. The room went very still. But I kept the samples, Samuel said, and his chin came up again and his voice came back. Because you always told me, sir, you always said the truth doesn't need a good memory. It just needs to be written down. My jaw was shaking. I pressed my teeth together and breathed through my nose and stared at the ceiling for 3 full seconds, so I would not cry in front of every person in that room. I failed. 1 tear, just one tracking down the side of my face. Margaret rested her hand briefly on the railing. Your Honor, the respondent rests. Judge Harrison looked at Eleanor. He looked at Victor. He looked at Julian, who sat with both hands pressed over his mouth, shoulders shaking without sound. Then he picked up his pen and began to write. And from the back of the courtroom, 2 officers from the Harris County Sheriff's Department stood up and moved toward the aisle. The rain had stopped by the time we walked out of the courthouse. I did not notice it at first. I was focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on the solid weight of the wooden box under my arm lighter, now that its contents had been entered into evidence, but still somehow the heaviest thing I had ever carried. Margaret walked beside me close enough that our shoulders nearly touched, not speaking, just present in the way that only people who have fought alongside you understand how to be. Behind us, inside the building we had just left, Eleanor Pendleton was being read her Miranda rights by a Harris County deputy. Victor Sloan was on a call with a criminal defense attorney, his voice audible even through the glass doors, stripped of every ounce of its former authority. Julian had not been arrested, not yet, but Reeves had told me quietly before we left the corridor that an investigation was open and that Julian had agreed to cooperate fully. I did not know what to feel about that. I was not sure I had the capacity left to feel anything complicated. Arthur! Margaret stopped at the top of the courthouse steps. The wet concrete stretched out below us, reflecting the pale gray sky. She turned to face me, and for the first time all day her professional composure softened at the edges. Her eyes were bright. You did it. I looked at her for a long moment. My chest ached not with pain exactly, but with the particular exhaustion that comes after holding yourself rigid for months and finally being allowed to let go. We did it, I said. My voice came out rough and old and very tired, and I did not mind that one bit. She smiled. It reached all the way to the corners of her eyes, and I thought not for the first time that Diana would have liked Margaret Hale enormously. Samuel was waiting at the bottom of the steps. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and when he saw me coming down toward him, his entire face changed. The worry lifted off it like a weather system passing, and what was underneath was something open and relieved, and just barely holding itself together. Well, he said. Well, I said, and I clapped one hand on his shoulder and felt him exhale a long, shuddering exhale, the kind that carries 6 weeks of fear out of the body all at once. His hand came up and covered mine on his shoulder, and he gripped it once hard, and that was enough. We drove back to the house in Margaret's car, the 3 of us. Nobody talked much. The city moved past the windows, gas stations, oak trees, an elementary school, with a bright yellow fence, and I watched it go by and thought about Diana. Diana, who had planted the fig tree in the backyard when Julian was 4. Diana, who had kept every birthday card our children ever gave her in a box under the bed. Diana, who had made me promise the week before she died, when she still had enough clarity to make promises matter, that I would protect what we had built together. I tried, sweetheart, I thought. I tried. We pulled into the driveway at noon. The house looked the same as it always had, white clapboard green shutters, the fig tree enormous now, in the corner of the yard, its branches heavy and dark after the rain. I sat in the car for a moment after Margaret turned off the engine. I want to do something, I said. Margaret and Samuel both looked at me. Diana always said that money is only worth what you do with it, while you're still around to see it do something good. I set the empty wooden box on my knee. I want to set up a foundation, in her name, for students who can't afford college first generation, the ones who remind me of who I was at 22. I looked at Margaret. Can you help me with that? Margaret's eyes went bright again. She pressed her lips together for a moment, composing herself, and nodded. The Diana Pendleton Foundation, she said. 501 Ask 3. I'll draft the paperwork this week. Samuel made a sound beside me, a short, soft sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but was somehow both at once. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and looked out the window at the fig tree. She'd have loved that, he said thickly. I know she would, I said. I got out of the car. The wet grass bent under my shoes. The air smelled like rain and earth, and the particular green smell of the fig tree after a storm. I stood there for a long moment, just breathing. The wooden box was empty now. The evidence was in the hands of the court. The truth was part of the record, and the house, my house, Diana's house. The house with the green shutters and the enormous fig tree was still standing. Some things survive, some truths hold. If you have ever watched someone you love be taken advantage of and wondered whether it was worth fighting back, I want you to know something. It is always worth it. The paper never lies, the record never forgets. And the truth, if you take care of it, if you seal it and label it and carry it through the rain, the truth will always find a way to be heard. Standing in front of that fig tree, I thought about something my mother used to say when I was a boy. God doesn't always stop the storm, but he never lets you drown alone. I believe that now, more than I ever did at 72. Every sealed envelope, every quiet night, Samuel swapped that tea, every document Margaret filed. I believe something larger than luck was holding all of it together. This is a family story I never wanted to have. And if I am being honest with myself, I was not innocent of blindness. I chose comfort over vigilance. I saw the signs and told myself I was imagining things. I let love make me slow. So, here is my advice from one human being to another: do not wait until the box is buried in the ground to start paying attention. Watch the people closest to you, not with suspicion, but with clarity. Family betrayal does not always arrive loud. Most of the time it arrives with a smile and a cup of tea. My personal opinion. No amount of money is worth what family betrayal costs the soul, and no legal victory feels the way you think it will. It feels like surviving nothing more, nothing less. This was my family story. I hope it never becomes yours. If this story moved, you made you think, or reminded you of someone you love, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel, so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. It means more than you know. A gentle note: the stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and life lessons. If that is not the content you are looking for right now, that is completely okay. Step away and find what truly speaks to you. No judgment, only respect.